Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the SEC and the Big Ten and the playoff and how if they don't get what they want, if they don't get a ton of teams in the field, it could create kind of an uncertain future around the playoff and around college football as a whole. But let's get into segment 4 here and talk about the college football 25, top 25 teams. Obviously, we talked about the list on Friday that came out, the hardest places to play, the top 25 offenses and defenses, and I had some issues with some of those lists. Obviously, did not necessarily love the toughest places to play list. I don't think Bama is the second toughest places to play if you take the team out of that stadium, which I think is the way it should be broke down. The offenses and defenses I had a myriad of problems with, but at the end of the day, it means we're a step closer to this game, which is obviously huge news. But let's get into the top 25 teams and just break down where everyone sits. And the top team in this game is the top team in the country, by my estimation. It is the Georgia Bulldogs. They're at 95, and they're the top team. I have no problem with that. Ohio State right behind them at 93. No problem with that either. Oregon, Bama, Texas right there. Again, those are the top 5 teams in the country, in my opinion, and will be the teams that absolutely will find their way into the playoff. And it'll be interesting to watch them unfold over this year. But then some of the issues start for this list. Obviously, Clemson being at 90, I think they're a very good team, and I think they absolutely are a team that can be up in this kind of realm this year. But going into this year, I would not have them there. I would have them somewhere in the 13 to 15 kind of range, and I don't, I'd have teams like Utah ahead of them, I think. I think I had Penn State. I think I had Michigan. A lot of these teams that I just think are a little bit better. I think there's a little bit too much leaning on the talent level of these teams. Obviously, Clemson is going to be an elite team from a talent perspective. LSU, the exact same. Miami on this list, absolutely the exact same. It doesn't change that these teams coming into the season have serious questions pretty much across the board, whether it's Clemson, not necessarily as much on defense. I shouldn't necessarily say across the board, but the offense is a worry. You have LSU, where the defense is a big worry. Miami, just a ton of transfers coming in that you don't really necessarily know how all of that is going to work out. So I don't necessarily love that. I don't think really any of those teams are top 13. I mean, they're all kind of in that conversation, and ranking these teams is obviously very tough, but I don't think I would have Clemson and LSU where they're at. I think I would have Miami just a touch lower, and these are obviously kind of nitpicky things, but overall, I think it's just a little bit too much leaning on the talent level of a team and not necessarily the what we saw from a year ago from that team. So it'll be kind of interesting to watch these adjust over the first couple of weeks. And then you have some bigger issues. And obviously, I'm going to surround Colorado here. It's no disrespect to Colorado. I got some comments on my video from yesterday. I promise I like Colorado. I promise I like Dion, but they're not the number 16 team in the country. Going into the season, they're just not. Coming out of the season, maybe they are. Maybe they shock me and a lot of people and, make their way up into that conversation. But they're just not the same team as Oklahoma. They're not the same team as Virginia Tech. They're not the same team as Kansas or Arizona or Oklahoma State. So I have a little bit of an issue with that. They were a top 10 defense, or a top 10 offense, in the game, which is insane. This was, I believe, somewhere in the 70s or 60s in total offense a year ago. They were a top 20 defense. Not even close. I'll be totally honest with you. A year ago, they were downright bad on the defensive side of the ball. And this year, although they've made some really, really good moves in the portal and absolutely have a much better defense than they had a year ago personnel-wise, they're not number 16 in the country. I can promise you that. They are not on the level defensively of an Oklahoma or an Oklahoma State, or particularly some of the Virginia Techs, obviously going to be a really good defense. So I do have a little bit of an issue with that. Definitely not going to be my favorite thing in the world, but also I understand the game that they're playing. If you want to, get Colorado early on in the game, absolutely, you're going to get a really good team. And then when the season comes around, I expect that to start to drop just a little bit. But overall, I do think this is going to be probably a beneficial thing for this game, because it's going to get a lot of people playing it. That's for sure, because they want to play Shedeur Sanders, and they don't want to play with a team that is a 76 overall. They do want to play with a team that's 87. So don't necessarily hate on it too much, but I promise you they are not the same team that Oklahoma is. I can promise you, even the Big 12 and everyone in Vegas is saying they are not the teams that Kansas or Oklahoma State are in the Big 12. So it'll be interesting to see that kind of adjust, but I suggest if you want to play as a really good Colorado team, you might just want to do it early on in this game, just before the season starts, let's just say. But some other small issues, I don't think Wisconsin's on OU's level. I don't think USC is. Michigan, to me, should be a little bit ahead of Penn State and Utah, as should Notre Dame above Clemson and LSU. But although those are kind of, nitpicky things, maybe I would move up Notre Dame to a 91. So it's really not all that much of a difference. But the biggest problem I have with this list, and the problem that I feel like everyone's kind of catching on to, but we should shine even more light on it, is did they just forget Tennessee existed? I'm not fully understanding how the conversations have gone in this room where they weren't on the top 25 offense list. They absolutely are a top 25 offense. They weren't on the top 25 defense list. They absolutely are a top 25 defense. They weren't on the top 10 toughest places to play in the country list. They absolutely are that as well. And they're not a top 25 team overall, and they are that as well. So I'm very, very confused what the conversation was around Tennessee. I am not a conspiracy theory guy by any means, but there's some weird stuff happening around Tennessee in the EA studios because I have no earthly idea what they were watching. I have no earthly idea what team they're looking at because this is a top 20 team in the country on offense, on defense, and overall. This is going to be a really, really good Vols team, and I'm very, very confused how they're not on this list. I'm just flabbergasted, to be totally honest with you. Neither is Missouri, as I just noticed, to be totally honest with you, and that's insane as well. So obviously there's some issues with this. There's going to be some issues with all of this stuff, and as it kind of unfolds, we'll obviously get some adjustments to this. That's actually one of the things that I really like about these rankings is you have a ton of teams kind of locked together. And obviously it looks a little bit weird right now, but you have 7 teams at 88 overall. You have 9 teams at 87. That does kind of give them the leeway to bump a team up a couple of notches or down a couple of notches, and these rankings to kind of take a little bit better of shape where you don't have a ton of teams tied at 88 and 87. You have, more teams occupying just one spot and not a lot of ties throughout it. So I do think that's probably a good way to go about business. Another thing I really like about this is there's no team that's 99. In 2014, Alabama was a 99 team. I really like that Alabama team. They were not a 99. And frankly, I don't think that really exists in college football. I think 2019 LSU is roughly as close as I've seen, and I would have them at probably an 87 or an 86 because of the defensive struggles they had. So I just don't think that should ever be a thing in this game, and very much like that they're getting a little bit further away from that as we get down the road, because you add a team that's 99 into the game, it's going to be a little bit less of a great experience when you're playing that team and they're just dominating you across the board. So I think that's obviously something that I really much like about this. I think by like week 3 or week 4, we'll have a little bit better of a consensus of how these rankings really are. You don't have a ton of ties at 6 through 8 and at 9 through, 15 and then 16 through 25. You have some variation in these rankings. It's definitely something that I think will happen pretty aggressively over the first, couple of weeks of this game rolling out. And it'll be really interesting to kind of watch that unfold. And obviously, this is going to be a game that everyone is incredibly excited for. But some of the rankings are just off a little bit, whether it's Colorado being a top 10 offense in the country or being a top 20 defense, or Clemson being a top 10 offense in this game, which they frankly just are not going into this season. They could be, obviously with Garrett Riley at the helm. There's tons of things that Clemson could do this upcoming year on the offensive side of the ball, but going into the year, they're not a top 10 offense. I'm not even sure if they're a top 20 offense, but at the end of the day, I understand this is not an easy thing to do. I understand they are working off, some sketchy waters because you're doing it before the season starts and you don't really know how these teams are going to develop. But overall, I just had some issues with some of the rankings and some of the ways that it was broken down. So minor issues at most, definitely not necessarily anything that will make me too mad at the game by any means, but definitely some things that I don't necessarily love. And they mainly revolve around, Colorado being a little bit propped up in these conversations, and I don't necessarily have too much of an issue with that because I understand who Colorado is, I understand who Dion is, and how important they are to this game and to this, being a big deal, but also they're just not, what they're rated in this game overall, and also just leaving Tennessee and leaving Missouri, those teams off these lists is just beyond insane. There's really no argument to be made that they're not better than most of the teams on that list, frankly. So I think that's obviously my biggest issue, is just leaving off two of the best teams in the country off your top 25 list and really having them nowhere to be found on most of the lists that they broke out. I believe Missouri was on the top 25 offenses, but overall, just ridiculous that those teams were left off, and definitely will be something that I think will likely be fixed throughout the season, with these rankings kind of updating and changing every day. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. Obviously, it means we're just a day closer. It means we're just a little bit closer to this game coming out, and they're definitely getting people riled up, that's for sure. I think people are going to be ready to play this game, and I obviously am. So next week, I'll break down my top 10 teams that I'm going to use possibly in Dynasty as I start it. No Power 5 teams. I want to start from the bottom and work my way up, obviously. So be on the lookout for that next week. But today we're going to do a little bit different of a Top 10 Tuesday. We're going to break down the best games in Week 0 and Week 1. We're about 56, 55 days out from this thing kicking off, and there's a ton of games to be excited about in the first couple of weeks. So I kind of wanted to get that excitement rolling, get everyone a little bit pumped up for this season. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.